Hi and welcome. I'm really excited to have you here and to be able to share with you the Volunteer Satisfaction Index. So, you may have heard about it and you don't know all what there is to know about it. And that's exactly why I have these introduction sessions. We get a lot of people reaching out to me. And so I decided I would just have a larger information session to answer a lot of people's questions about the VSI. So, we have a short, brief presentation. So, I'll just get to it. I'll share my screen here in a brief presentation of introduction to the VSI. So let me share this here with you and we'll go from the. So the VSI is the Volunteer Satisfaction Index, and it's really important ultimately to measure what matters. And so the VSI is a survey instrument, a survey questionnaire for volunteer job satisfaction that is comprised of 22 questions, four dimensions. There are four subscales that comprise those 22 questions. And this is a multidimensional scale that was developed specifically for the unique context of volunteerism. In fact, it was actually created initially in 1999. The development of the VSI emerged as part of my thesis research when I was in graduate school studying organizational communication. And it was subsequently published in the Journal of Social Service Research in 2001. It was edited from its thesis version and actually published. And I went back to work as a practitioner in the volunteer administration field. So I stopped actively researching it. However, others in the academic realm did continue to research it. And so it's continued to be validated by other researchers and not only validated, but validated in other cultural contexts globally. So clearly, the drivers that were identified have held up over time and have had significant impact on the volunteerism research for the past 2 decades. And there's been over 400 plus source citations on Google Scholar. ResearchGate has a slightly lower number, but it's up there in the hundreds. So the VSI wasn't just a slapstick, let's throw the survey together. It took several years to develop its research-driven, evidence-based survey that was really grounded in practical experience as well as research. So it all started, quite honestly, with my own experience as a volunteer coordinator. I had by the early mid 90s, had been the volunteer coordinator for the Nature Conservancy. And then I moved up to Oregon, where I had the great opportunity to be the volunteer coordinator for a youth mentoring program. It was an excellent program that paired youth with adult mentors for a curriculum driven 7-month program. And these youth mentor pairs would go through these cycles. So I experienced something in both of these jobs that kind of stuck with me. And here's kind of how it kind of really evidenced itself. I was on my way out the door, literally leaving my office in Oregon. I had decided to return to graduate school and to do so in Chico, California. And so I was I can remember clearly the afternoon. I was standing in my office, packing up the last of my things. And up the stairs to our little office comes this gentleman, Mike, who'd been a wonderful, wonderful local community member who had been involved now in 2 of my cycles of my program. Again, this was a kind of a 7-month cycle where we'd pair these students with these adult volunteer mentors. And Mike had 2 pairings. He'd been through 2 cycles, and he hadn't had particularly great experience. He had some of our pairs had just a awesome experience. They were the poster children for our recruitment, and some less so. And he hadn't really bonded with his youth mentor over these cycles, and in fact he'd been kind of frustrated. And here he comes, ready to sign up again. Now, on the flip side, I had volunteers who seemingly from all observable standpoint had been having fabulous experiences and then didn't sign up again when the next cycle came. So, I asked Mike, why do you keep doing this to yourself? Because I know how, because we, talked quite a bit about this experience. And he just very clearly said, because I like you, Roseanna. And that always really stuck with me because, he had been originally drawn to the organization because of our mission. but he had stayed and continued to be engaged because of his relationship with me, in addition to the mission. So that really, stuck with me. And then I fast forward, I had returned to graduate school, and there I'm like, there's my research, right? I want to research something around volunteer satisfaction. And I go to the library to do that in my quantitative methodologies class. And I find that there really is not a survey for volunteer satisfaction. In the mid 90s, there wasn't. Most organizations at that point were either borrowing instruments from paid work, or they were doing in-house, they put together the survey just for that research. But there wasn't for unpaid work, a measurement that had been psychometrically validated. And now that wasn't true for paid work. For paid work, there were many measurements at that point, but the investigation of volunteerism had really just started at that point. So I had inadvertently discovered a gap in the literature. In fact, I went to my quantitative methodologies teacher, Dr. Ruth Fesley, and I told Ruth that I was going to have to change my research paper because I couldn't find a measurement instrument for volunteer satisfaction. And she quickly corrected me and said, no, you've just found your research topic. You're going to develop a measurement instrument for volunteer satisfaction. So that's what I spent the next 2 to 3 years doing, was just that. We had to define the construct, right? How do you operationalize this idea of volunteer satisfaction? Why does it need to be separated? Really understanding that the context of unpaid labor really guides the direction for how a measurement instrument would need to exist for that specific unique context, right? Because volunteer work is intrinsically fundamentally different. I'm not going to get into there now, but that's part of the lit review of the whole, thesis. So then we develop the instrument, vet the questions, really have to go, are the questions getting at what we want to? There were multiple people laid eyes on those. Ultimately, the original VSI was conceptualized as having 40 questions with 5 dimensions. It was originally conceptualized as having 5 dimensions, with 8 questions tapping each of these 5 dimensions. Now, what we found, we set out to try prove, and ultimately did establish rather, was reliability and validity. And so reliability and validity, just a quick refresh for your data savviness. Reliability is a function of consistency, that we can measure reliably, return the same consistent results over time. But we could be measuring something reliably and it not be valid, right? We could be measuring what we think is satisfaction, but be measuring, some other concept that's related, but not be really hitting the mark. But reliability would return consistent results. Now, validity is that you're hitting the mark. You're measuring what you think you're measuring. So that would mean they should be clustered around a target. That would be indicating accuracy. And so if they're too scattered, then you don't have then you may not be being accurate. So you can have it be somewhat around the area, but not reliable, right? You want it to return results, be consistent regardless of organization, time of year, things like that, right? So a survey instrument that is both valid and reliable, the measurement is both accurate. You're measuring the concept that you think you're measuring, and it's consistent. You're getting reliable results consistently over time. Okay. So reliability is a little bit easier to establish than validity. So fortunately, we established both, and other researchers continued to establish validity. So here are the drivers that emerged. And the scale ultimately came down to 22 items. It's just a fascinating discussion, also the items that never loaded. And we identified 4 drivers. These are 4 drivers that drive the engagement of the volunteer experience. I'll go over each of them in turn in subsequent slides. Organizational support, participation efficacy, group integration, and empowerment. And these are the terms we coined to bring together these like variables that group together through inferential statistic analysis. We ran it through a variety of statistical models, and we came up with these and that people have subsequently used and continued to validate. So organizational support. This is the level of encouragement, resources, and acknowledgement provided by an organization. It's everything from your expressed appreciation to having the resources needed when a volunteer needs peer support or resources to do the job. They could be emotional or they could be educational. So a question on the VSI that taps this is on a scale of 1 to 7, indicate your level of satisfaction with the availability of getting help when I need it. Right? That's going to vary depending on the definition of help, depends on the role of the volunteer. Participation efficacy is what we know as the impact to the client or end result. And so it could be an animal, the event of a pet-oriented organization, or an organization focused on the environment. It would be like the end results, the outcome, the impact that the volunteers are making on the mission of the organization. And so the extent to which volunteers feel that they are making a difference and contributing, the level of satisfaction with the difference my volunteer work is making. Group integration. The social bonds and sense of belonging that volunteers experience with the organization. This is especially true not only of the relationship within the organization itself, but the relationship with other volunteers in the organization, specifically the sense of belonging, of having a role and a purpose that is actually valued. This is a deeper level, and having that form of connection there. And it's not a support connection, it's an integration. I am part of, I identify with this organization. So my relationship with other volunteers in the organization, how satisfying is that? And that is a driver for volunteer satisfaction. A fourth and final subscale that emerged was empowerment. And this is really kind of fascinating because the original scale, like I said, had five areas. So one area was this communication quality area. And what we found was some of the areas stayed exactly the same. Group integration was one of them, participation efficacy, but a couple of other areas, specifically communication quality and work assignment, either disappeared entirely or the communication related items loaded into these four different ones. And empowerment is part of this a little bit. Volunteers' perception of the autonomy and control of their roles. How much do they have the ability to utilize their own thought process and decision making, skills and abilities, experiences, life experiences, to make decisions in the moment to do their job? Within the constraints of the organization, but how constrained do they feel? Do they feel it's a reasonable trade-off, right? And so please indicate your level of satisfaction, the chance I have to utilize my knowledge and skills in my volunteer work, the chance I have to utilize it. Interestingly, there was another question about advancing or being recognized and being given more responsibility, like a professional development type question. And that has never loaded on a volunteer satisfaction survey. So don't kid ourselves, volunteers don't actually necessarily find the experience of being given more work highly a satisfying role, but they do want to know that you value and that their knowledge and skills that they brought, and you trust them to make decisions based on the constraints you provided them within the job role. So ultimately, there are four dimensions of volunteer satisfaction index survey questions: organizational support, group integration, participation efficacy, and empowerment. And these four shape and drive the experience of volunteers once they've joined your organization. Now, this is different than the motivation to join an organization, though it should be reflected. And here's how you can front load some of this. So I left academia after a bit and after 10 years, and I went to go work as the director of volunteer services at a local hospital where I spent for 16 years. And during that 16 years, I utilized the volunteer satisfaction index as a framework to develop everything I developed in a very highly engaging volunteer retentive program. Built a program from 200 to 450 volunteers at its zenith pre-COVID. We were running along, had over 29 programs under that umbrella, an excellent reputation in the organization, no shortage of volunteers reaching out to their friends and fellow spheres of influence through positive word of mouth. And so we had a really nice thing going. And this really, I believe, all was because of the volunteer satisfaction index. I use it as a needs analysis, on a regular basis, but every 2 years, administering it, where are we, how are we doing? Because these areas, these dimensions can be used as levers in different areas, and segmenting it by location or program would help me see that there was a deficit, right? If you're having a variety of volunteers dropping off in a particular service area, there's a retention issue. How can we attach it to behaviors? Volunteer satisfaction allowed us to show that, right? That these volunteers did not feel autonomy and empowerment. They felt very constricted, and therefore their particular location was less satisfying. And we could really speak to that in the data. Pulse checks, again, when you do find a problem, just a little subscale, just really quickly being able to administer it. This is helpful for both recruitment and retention, just at a surface level for operations. you can front load your messaging with recruitment. Here's a place you're going to be integrated. You're going to find meaning. We're going to provide you with education and training. We're going to provide you with that organizational support. You're going to have impact. You're going to make a difference, participation efficacy. Because you don't know the driving motivator of each person's individual preference of where what's really specifically driving them, your recruitment messaging can touch on and start to front load these satisfaction messages that you're going to find these things satisfying here in this experience. Now, once your volunteer when somebody has, signed up, a community member signed up to volunteer, you got to continue to live that reality, right? So you promised them that it's going to have organizational, support. Then your program needs to have that. And you can use, again, the pulse check to figure out which programs need more of that. For example, in my experience, we had a very frontward facing patient ambassador program where volunteers were highly trained and allowed to round autonomously. There's that empowerment piece on patients within with a script and on a specific nursing unit. It was highly engaged role. Volunteers loved it. The hospital loved it. And that role, though, at one point we found that we were having volunteers drop off after about a 9-month span. I found that there was this turnover. People who could stay after 9 months stayed, and there seemed to be this drop off. And after doing a little pulse check, found that it was the two things. It was organizational support. They didn't feel like they had the resources needed because they ran into some questions like, what do I do in this situation? And they wanted a little bit more immediate resource. The other was group integration. Because they were very solo and it was a very autonomous role, they had no real contact with other volunteers on a regular basis. So very easily, we adjusted that I implemented a cohort-based onboarding and training program. So I would wait till I had somewhere around 6 to 8 volunteers who were interested in that placement. And although it meant a slower intake, when I did bring them all together, they stayed longer. So it was worth the investment and wait on the time. Bringing them together, having them train together allowed two things. It allowed the group integration. They had a cohort that they went through this patient ambassador class together with to train for the position. And because they were all newbies together, we brought them together continuously. They were a support mechanism for each other, became friendly, could actually reach out to each other because there might be another volunteer doing the same job on a different floor. They would now were friendly, could actually bounce that idea off somebody. And that became really helpful. So these were data-driven decisions, right? Where do I put my resources? How do I know which program needs this? The Volunteer Satisfaction Index. Very practical for needs analysis. So living in a data system, an ecosystem awash with data, right? And the world of volunteerism is no different than any of these. We know that we want to collect data. So I've now made the VSI survey available more widely. It's been used by academics for a couple of decades and less so by practitioners, although it's been used by many organizations. When researchers have used it, working with an organization, it's always been under the realm of somebody doing research. And so occasionally I have sold the survey license on a case-by-case scenario as people reached out to me, but I never really did much with it until I left being a director of volunteer services a few years ago. And the 2021 study from Serbia, which validated it in an Eastern European cultural context, really heightened the interest. I get a lot of requests for the VSI. And I figured it was probably time to really kind of maybe get it out there and let people be aware of it in the nonprofit world and make it affordable at a really, modest license fee, really just to make it doable, to be able to make it available. So I sell it in increments of 50 for self-service. So there's really two options available for administration should somebody want to start using the VSI with their population of volunteers. One is the self-service option. That's designed, you can just drop into my website. It's sold in increments of 50. We established that based on recent board reports. You would provide some board reports or wherever your reporting is monthly, where you're reporting these numbers. How many active volunteers do you say you have? Those are the numbers we would use. So we take that as your base number, and you buy, let's say you have, 200 volunteers on average, or 220 volunteers on average, you're going to buy a survey for 250. So you have enough, right? And it's population-based pricing. We add about $3.25 per survey at that for that small of a population. And there's a $350 setup fee to actually set up and get the survey ready for you. So and send it to you. So that is that's the base. So you can start for $187.50. What's great about it too is the VSI, actually you can buy optionally the VSI user guide, which has, a bunch of applications and other implications for scoring, and you get the scoring key. So you get the survey, you get the scoring key, and you bring your own data insights to it, and you can administer it as you see fit. The hosted version, should you not want to administer it yourself, I have a variety of hosted packages available. So using a SurveyMonkey platform, either can just give you a link and you have your volunteers, go to that link and give you a variety of email communications to send out to them. Or I can take on the whole thing. You give me your mailing list, your email mailing list, and I send out the email to the volunteers, and you don't do anything. At the end of either of those survey, no matter how you administer it through SurveyMonkey, I give you a report. Depending on the survey package, it has a variety of granularity and detail, and next steps action plan, what to do with the data. So there's some benefit in having it hosted, and then there's some benefit in having self-service. Either one, they're priced for the nonprofit sector, again, being very reasonable licensure fee, just to make it doable to be able to offer it for use. So that's the VSI. It's a little bit about it. If you'd like to learn more about our self-service option, I encourage you to visit the website. I have a website here. Just go to it quickly, and on my website, periscopebpa.com, the VSI self-survey license page will actually bring you to the pricing table, where it gives you how much this costs based on our volunteer survey populations of 50, and it starts from $187.50. And should you want the hosted version, you can click right here and find out about our hosted options. And the hosted options has a variety of scalable survey pricing packages, and starting from $350. And you'll see that we have the VSI Core, the VSI Complete, and the VSI Ultimate. And again, those really just vary depending on the level of granularity of reporting that you would like support with from Periscope BPA. And each one has package add-ons for this survey. So I hope you've learned more. And when you're interested in reaching out, I'm happy to talk to you more about the VSI. And little VSI readiness checklist that will pop up on the survey hosting page, just to ask for some questions. And are you ready to do so? So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if there are any questions at all that anybody has about the VSI, about its development or its application or its availability, and how you might access it for your organization. I see a question in the chat about the action plan handbook. The action plan handbook is not available. Well, it's available always. You don't have to buy the license at all to get the VSI guide. Yes, you can buy the VSI guide itself. It actually does have a review only copy of the measurement instrument in there. Yes, so you can look at that ahead of time. The VSI user guide is it's available for sale on VSI, on Periscope BPA, on our store. It includes, like I said, it has the history, the development, goes into the scoring, the reliability. It's kind of the functional manual for if you were to administer the VSI on your own, some of the information you might want or need to, validate why you're using that instrument to somebody. And there's implications for its retention analysis as well in there, which is really handy. Oh, and of course, the review only copy of the instrument, so you can see what the questions are. Right. Well, that looks like to be the only questions. And I appreciate those of you who showed up today to do this. You are welcome. Absolutely. Yes, please reach out if you have any other questions. And I'm gonna actually do these little information sessions about once a month, just because it's a way to provide the information answers that people seem to be most frequently asked me about the VSI. So might as well just do a little information session and get everybody. So if you know anybody else, or you want somebody else in your organization to hear this, just invite them just invite them next month if you're working on your budget or something. Exactly. Okay. Well, I thank you for spending the morning with me. Best to you. Bye-bye.